The world Jonathan Blake inhabited was a meticulously crafted machine of wealth, power, and precision. It was a world of private terminals where the ground crew worked with the silent deference of well-paid servants, where every flight was perfectly on schedule, and where the only sound was the low, purposeful hum of jet engines. Jonathan was the master of this world, a man who had built an empire from nothing, and his existence was a testament to his absolute control. On this particular Tuesday, that control was absolute. He strode across the tarmac, his suitcase rolling behind him with a soft, confident whisper against the polished concrete. The pilot was already at the top of the stairs, a silent, professional nod his only greeting. A flight to London waited, a deal that would reshape an entire industry, a presentation he planned to revise during the quiet hours of the flight. Everything was perfectly, utterly on schedule. Then, just as his foot was about to land on the first step of the jet, a small, tentative tug pulled at the sleeve of his tailored suit. Jonathan turned, a sharp, automatic motion born of a life of constant vigilance. He expected a last-minute document, a forgotten detail, but what he saw made the ground beneath his feet feel suddenly unstable. 3 little girls stood below, barely tall enough to reach his waist. They looked about 5 years old, and were so impossibly identical they seemed like a mirror's reflection. They had long, flaxen hair, eyes the color of a winter sky, and simple, pale red dresses paired with mismatched sneakers. Their faces were pale, their hands clutched tightly together, and their gazes, fixed firmly on him, held a desperate plea that didn't belong on a child's face. The smallest one stepped forward, her body trembling, and whispered a single word, "Help." The sound of his private jet's engines, the professional calls of the ground crew, the distant roar of a commercial airliner, all of it faded into a profound, unnerving silence. Jonathan stood frozen, his mind scrambling to process this intrusion. His world, built on logic and profit margins, had no category for this. A businessman, a strategist, a titan of industry, what was he supposed to be to 3 frightened children on an empty tarmac? He didn't think, he simply acted. He stepped down from the stairs, his instincts taking over where his logic hesitated, and he knelt on the tarmac. A man accustomed to standing above all others was now brought low by 3 small, silent figures. "Where are your parents?" he asked, his voice a low, careful rumble, as if he were trying not to scare a wild animal. The answer came quickly, from all 3 in unison, a fragile chorus of a broken home. "We don't know." A call came from the jet behind him, a reminder that they were ready for takeoff, that a flight to London was waiting, that the world was still turning on his schedule. But Jonathan didn't turn around. His mind was no longer in the sky. It was grounded entirely in that moment, in the 3 frightened faces in front of him, in the nervous rise and fall of their shoulders. These children weren't just lost. They were alone. He reached for his phone again, not to check an email or a message, but to make a different call. It took less than a minute to cancel his flight. Then he stood up, took a deep breath, and held out his hand. "Come with me," he said softly, and without a second's hesitation, each girl reached out, their hands finding his in a chain of unyielding trust. One hand, then another, then the third. He walked them toward the terminal, away from the aircraft, away from the future he thought he had been racing toward. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Blake was late. And for the first time in his life, he didn't care. Inside the quiet terminal, Jonathan led the three girls to a bench near the large windows overlooking the tarmac. The flight crew of his private jet waited, uncertain, but he gave them no further instructions. His focus was entirely on the children. They sat close together, knees touching, holding hands as if letting go would make them disappear. Despite their matching appearance, each girl had subtle differences. One had a tiny scar near her eyebrow. Another clutched the hem of her dress with nervous fingers, and the third kept her eyes fixed on the floor, as if staring hard enough might keep her from crying. Jonathan crouched again, trying to appear smaller, less intimidating. He wasn't used to comforting children. He wasn't used to being this close to fear he couldn't fix with money or negotiation. Gently, he asked, "Can you tell me your names?" The girl on the left answered first. "I'm Emily." "I'm Sophie," said the one in the middle, her voice softer than a whisper. "And I'm Mia," added the third, finally glancing up at him. He repeated their names aloud, trying to commit them to memory. Emily, Sophie, Mia. That's easy to remember. "Are you the airport boss?" Emily asked suddenly, her blue eyes wide and searching. Jonathan shook his head with a small smile. "No, just someone who was about to fly away." "But you stopped me." Mia bit her lip. "We didn't mean to be bad." "You weren't bad," he said gently. "You were brave." Sophie turned slightly toward him. "Our mommy got sick. She fell down at the airport and they took her in the loud car. They said we couldn't go, but we didn't want to stay with the people in the uniforms." Jonathan's chest tightened. "An ambulance." All three nodded in sync. He leaned back on his heels and exhaled slowly, realizing they had likely escaped the temporary care of airport security or even a child protection officer. And somehow, instead of running away, they had stayed close to the jet they saw first, his. They had chosen him without knowing anything about him. "Do you know your mom's name?" he asked carefully. "Eleanor Harper," said Emily. The name hit him like a wave of cold air. He hadn't heard it in years. Eleanor. Ellie. The woman he'd walked away from when his ambition won out over his heart. She was the one that lingered in old letters he never deleted and photographs he never framed. He hadn't known she had children. He hadn't even known she was still in the same city. He stood slowly and pulled out his phone, calling his assistant with clipped instructions to locate all recent hospital intakes under the name Eleanor Harper. The ride to the hospital was quiet, except for the soft humming of the car engine and the occasional rustle of candy wrappers as the girls quietly shared the crackers Jonathan had given them. He drove more slowly than usual, his eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror, where the three little girls sat huddled together in the back seat. Emily had leaned her head on Sophie's shoulder, and Mia looked out the window with a distant expression, her small fingers tracing patterns in the condensation. It struck Jonathan how natural they were around each other, how they moved like one gentle, bonded unit. It was a kind of closeness he had never seen, even among siblings he had known growing up. He couldn't stop glancing at them, wondering how they came from Eleanor, the woman who had once called him the most distant person she had ever loved. The moment he pulled up to the hospital entrance, and Nurse rushed forward with a look of confusion, clenched the edge of the chair. "You knew I had the right to know." He looked at her again, but her eyes remained closed, her breathing unchanged. He sat there until the nurse returned and gently reminded him the children were asking for him. When he stepped into the hallway, he found the girls sitting on a bench, still in their red dresses, looking even smaller under the weight of the fluorescent lights. Mia was holding a crayon drawing she had made on a clipboard. 3 stick girls holding hands with a tall figure beside them, all smiling under a big yellow sun. "She's still sleeping," he said gently as he approached. "But she's safe. The doctors are doing everything they can." "Will she wake up?" Sophie asked quietly. Jonathan didn't lie. "I hope so. And I'm going to stay here with you until she does." He sat down beside them, not as a businessman or a stranger, but as a man who had suddenly been handed a fragile, unplanned future, one he wasn't ready for, but one he already couldn't walk away from. The hospital became their temporary home, though none of them ever said it out loud. Jonathan checked into a nearby hotel suite, but barely spent any time there, choosing instead to remain at the hospital where the girls felt safest. Every morning began the same way. The girls would shuffle into Eleanor's room in their borrowed pajamas, whispering to her softly as if their voices alone could coax her awake. Nurses brought them small breakfasts, crayons, and coloring books to keep them occupied. And Jonathan sat with his laptop, not working so much as pretending to, his mind too clouded with questions that no spreadsheet could solve. The hospital became their temporary home, though none of them ever said it out loud. Jonathan checked into a nearby hotel suite, but barely spent any time there, choosing instead to remain at the hospital where the girls felt safest. Every morning began the same way. The girls would shuffle into Eleanor's room in their borrowed pajamas, whispering to her softly as if their voices alone could coax her awake. Nurses brought them small breakfasts, crayons, and coloring books to keep them occupied. And Jonathan sat with his laptop, not working so much as pretending to, his mind too clouded with questions that no spreadsheet could solve. Eleanor remained unconscious. The doctors explained that she had suffered a severe head injury, likely from fainting and hitting the tiled airport floor. There was no brain swelling, but her recovery depended on time and rest. She was stable, and that alone gave Jonathan a fragile thread of hope. He clung to it, even when he didn't know why. The girls, meanwhile, were adapting with a resilience he didn't expect. They weren't loud or overly emotional, but rather carried a quiet determination that made them seem older than they were. Emily took on a protective, almost maternal role. Sophie was the softest, the most anxious, always looking to the others before speaking. Mia, the smallest, had begun drawing more and more, her pages now filled with smiling families and suns and hearts. And often she included Jonathan, sometimes with messy brown hair and a tie, sometimes holding all 3 girls' hands. One afternoon, as they sat in the waiting room while Eleanor underwent another scan, Emily climbed into the chair beside Jonathan and asked, "Did you know our mom before?" The question made him freeze, then carefully close his laptop. "Yes, a long time ago," he answered. Emily studied his face. "Did you love her?" she asked suddenly. He didn't flinch. "I did." "Did she love you?" she asked next, her voice not accusing, only curious, as if she had a right to know because she did. "I think she did," he answered honestly. "But I left. I thought I had to. And that was a mistake." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She told us our dad was far away, that he didn't know about us, but that one day he might come." Jonathan looked at her, stunned. "She said that?" Emily nodded. "Not all the time. Just once. When Mia asked why we didn't have a daddy." Jonathan leaned forward, the weight of that simple truth sinking deep into his chest. Eleanor had never told him. She'd never reached out. But she had still left that door open in their hearts just wide enough for him to step through if he ever found his way back. Later that night, after the girls had fallen asleep in a quiet corner of the pediatric lounge, Jonathan sat alone in Eleanor's room. He watched the monitors pulse gently, the oxygen tube rising and falling with her breath. In her silence, he found himself speaking aloud to her more and more. "I met them, Ellie. They're beautiful, brave, smart, so much like you. It scares me. I don't know if I'm ready for what comes next, but I know I can't walk away this time." He reached out and took her hand carefully in his. "You should have told me. I would have come. I still came though. Maybe a little late, but I'm here now and I'm staying." The light in the room was low, shadows stretching across the floor. And for a moment, it felt like time stopped. He thought he saw her fingers twitch, but maybe that was just his imagination. Still, he didn't let go. When morning came, the girls ran into the room as always. Mia climbed onto the edge of the bed and whispered, "Good morning, Mommy. We brought you drawings." And Jonathan, watching her tiny fingers carefully tuck the picture under Eleanor's pillow, realized something that shook him deeply. He was no longer a man waiting to see what his place would be. He already belonged here. On the 5th day, something changed. Not in Eleanor's condition, which remained still and silent, but in Jonathan. The routine that once felt foreign was now instinct. He knew how each of the girls liked their cereal in the morning, how to braid Sophie's hair just tight enough so it wouldn't unravel, and how to find Mia's missing crayon colors with a calm he never thought himself capable of. But it wasn't only about logistics. It was the quiet shift inside him, the way he began to speak to the nurses, not as someone asking for updates, but as someone who belonged in the conversation. He stopped checking his phone every 5 minutes. Work calls went unanswered. For the first time since he had built his empire, Jonathan Blake was nowhere else but here. That morning, the girls were invited by the pediatric counselor to spend time in the hospital's playroom. It was the first time they were separated from Eleanor's room for more than a few minutes. Jonathan agreed, though he felt uneasy watching them disappear around the corner without him. He turned back to Eleanor's bedside. The silence in the room was almost too much after the days filled with whispers and movement. He sat down beside her and took a breath. "I've never said this before," he began softly, his hand lightly resting on the edge of the blanket near hers. "But I want to say it now in case you can hear me." He wasn't used to speaking without expecting a reply, but the quiet no longer scared him. He told her about the first moment he saw the girls, how they had stopped him with one word. He told her about their favorite snacks, about the picture. Confirm that's accurate. He paused, then nodded. It is. Has Child Protective Services contacted you? He exhaled slowly. Not yet. She lowered her voice. They will. If Eleanor doesn't wake up soon, the girls may be moved into temporary care. Unless you're willing to step in formally. Jonathan didn't hesitate. I'll do whatever I have to. The nurse nodded approvingly. Then I'd recommend speaking with a family attorney today. He made the call that evening, sitting in a quiet hallway while the girls watched cartoons in the family lounge. The lawyer he'd worked with for years answered immediately. But this time, their conversation was different. Jonathan wasn't calling to protect assets or dissolve a partnership. He was calling to become a guardian, a father, a man with something to lose. By nightfall, the first documents were already being prepared. He didn't know how long it would take to finalize, but he didn't care. He would fight if he had to, not because he owed it to Eleanor or to make up for lost time, but because in just a few days, those 3 girls had shown him a version of himself he never believed existed. Back in the hospital room, as the lights dimmed and the machines continued their steady rhythm, Jonathan watched Mia fall asleep with her head on Eleanor's shoulder, her small hand curled into the sheet. Sophie leaned against him, blinking slowly, and Emily whispered, "Will she wake up soon?" Jonathan looked at her, his voice steady. "I believe she will. And when she does, we'll all be right here." He didn't say it as a promise. He said it as a fact. Because somehow this was no longer about what might happen. It was about what already had. The 6th day began like the others had, quiet, slow, and full of uncertain hope. But there was a different weight in the air, something more fragile. Jonathan stood at the large window in the hospital hallway, staring down at the parking lot below as the first light of morning painted the cars in a dull gray. His coffee had gone cold in his hand, but he hadn't noticed. His mind was too full. The guardianship documents had been delivered that morning, and with one signature, everything would change, legally, permanently. He had gone from being a stranger to a man prepared to raise 3 little girls on his own. The thought should have terrified him, but it didn't. What terrified him now was the idea of losing them. Inside Eleanor's room, the girls had made a routine of sitting around her bed, talking to her as though she were listening. Emily told her about a funny nurse who made balloon animals. Sophie described a dream she'd had about a flying cat. Mia, always quiet, just drew pictures and laid them on the blanket one by one. Jonathan watched from the doorway, amazed at how natural it had become to see them there, how much they belonged. Every gesture, every word, every glance between them was filled with a kind of unspoken understanding, a closeness he had never witnessed before. The doctor came in later that morning, clipboard in hand, face unreadable. Jonathan followed him into the hallway, heart tightening. The words were clinical at first, stabilized vitals, minimal. Eleanor's return to consciousness was not instant clarity, but a slow and uneven climb from the darkness. The first few hours after she awoke were filled with confusion and fatigue, her words slurred, her memory coming in fragments. The doctors assured Jonathan this was expected and that recovery would take time. But to the girls, it didn't matter. Their mother had opened her eyes, had looked at them and spoken their names. That was all they needed. They stayed close to her side, whispering, drawing, and resting their heads on her blanket when she drifted back into shallow sleep. Jonathan remained in the background, both relieved and unsettled. Seeing Eleanor alive, speaking, reacting, it brought back a storm of emotions he thought he had buried. He wasn't sure where he stood in her life now, but he knew where he stood in the lives of the girls. He wasn't going anywhere. That truth had become part of him. Later that evening, the room was dim and quiet when Eleanor asked the question he had been expecting. Her voice was thin but clear. "How did you find them?" He sat down in the chair beside her bed, watching her carefully. The girls were asleep nearby, curled together on a sofa like a pile of kittens. He told her everything from the moment on the runway to the hospital to the hearing he had scheduled with his lawyer. She listened with wide, tearful eyes, her expression shifting from disbelief to something more painful. "I never meant to keep them from you," she said softly. "When I found out I was pregnant, you were already gone. You had made your choice, and I thought it would only hurt more to chase you down." Jonathan lowered his head. "I didn't know how to stay, Ellie. I didn't think I could be both. Someone you loved and someone who wanted more from the world. So, I left thinking it was the least damaging thing I could do." She smiled faintly. "And now?" He looked at her without hesitation. "Now, I know I was wrong, and I'm here. I've been here." Eleanor reached out slowly and took his hand. Her grip was weak but intentional. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered. "But I stopped waiting." Jonathan swallowed the emotion that threatened to rise in his throat. "I don't expect anything. I just want you to get better, and I want them to have a future. If you let me, I'll be part of it." They sat in silence for a long moment, fingers still laced together. Outside the window, the city lights flickered, unaware of the quiet reckoning unfolding in that small hospital room. The next day, the doctor cleared Eleanor to begin light physical therapy. Jonathan brought in clothes for her, comfortable, simple, and helped the girls prepare a room in the recovery ward with drawings and cards. Emily insisted on hanging a paper hard above the bed that read, "Welcome back, Mommy," in uneven handwriting. Sophie taped stars along the window's sill. Mia placed a small stuffed bear beside the pillow and whispered, "So you don't feel alone." Later that afternoon, Eleanor was transferred to the new room. She moved slowly but with determination, and Jonathan pushed the wheelchair with care, every turn deliberate. When they entered the decorated room, she stopped and covered her mouth with her hand, eyes welling with tears. "They did this?" she asked. "All on their own," he said. "They wanted you to feel home again." She looked around, then up at him. "What about you, Jonathan? Do you feel like you're home?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, then at the girls busying themselves with books and crayons in the corner. His chest tightened, not from uncertainty, but from something deeper and truer. "Yes," he said. "For the first time, I think I do." The weeks that followed were a delicate blend of healing, change, and quiet transformation. Eleanor's strength returned gradually. With each physical therapy session, her movements became steadier, her voice clearer, and her memory more reliable. The girls adjusted to her slower pace with surprising maturity, often helping her reach for things, brushing her hair gently in the mornings, and keeping her company through the long stretches of rest. They had waited for her to wake up, and now that she had, they moved through every moment with a kind of reverence, as if the simplest tasks had become sacred simply because they could share them again. Jonathan remained a constant presence, not because he felt obligated, but because he didn't want to be anywhere else. Every morning, he arrived at the hospital early enough to join them for breakfast, bringing coffee for Eleanor and cereal for the girls. He learned how to braid hair and how to answer the same bedtime question 3 different ways. His days were no longer defined by flights, deadlines, or contracts, but by slow walks down hospital corridors, reading picture books out loud, and sitting beside Eleanor as they talked quietly about the years they had missed and the days still ahead. One evening, while the girls were playing in the hospital garden under the watchful eye of a nurse, Eleanor asked him to take a walk with her. She was still using a cane, but her steps were steady. They made their way slowly down the garden path, the fading light casting long shadows across the stone. She didn't speak right away, and he didn't rush her. Eventually, she stopped beside a bench and sat down, looking at the sky. "I thought I was going to die," she said softly. "And the last thing I remember thinking was that I'd failed them, that they would be alone. I didn't know they'd find you." Jonathan sat beside her. "I didn't know they existed. But now that I do, I won't lose them. Or you." She looked at him, and the weariness in her face was replaced by something gentler. "What happens next?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope. "This is a copy of the guardianship papers. The judge approved them, but I didn't file them yet. I wanted to wait for you. If you're ready, we can do it together. As a family." Her eyes welled up. She took the envelope carefully, holding it in both hands. "You've changed. I've finally figured out what matters." That weekend, Eleanor was discharged from the hospital. Jonathan helped her and the girls settle into a temporary rental house just outside the city. It wasn't extravagant, but it had a small yard, bright windows, and 3 bedrooms, one for each girl. They filled the space with drawings, soft music, and the sound of laughter echoing down the hallway. Every night, Jonathan stayed for dinner. Some nights he didn't leave at all. Weeks turned into months and life slowly found its rhythm. Eleanor continued to recover, stronger each day. The girls enrolled in a small local school where they quickly made friends. Jonathan adjusted to balancing business calls between ballet recitals and pediatric appointments. He built a home not out of wealth, but out of presence, effort, and forgiveness. One Sunday morning, they visited the lake, the same lake from Eleanor's painting, the one that had unknowingly started it all. They stood together at the shore, the girls running along the edge, skipping stones and laughing. Jonathan and Eleanor watched them from a distance, hands quietly intertwined. "Do you ever wonder